longest, so I'm like really impressed.
Well, hey, you know, I walk humbly compared to the illustrious figures in here, and we're just glad to convene everyone and bring together everyone's insight and views. So it's cool. We bask in the reflected glory of everyone else here.
Thank you, Morgan.
All right, we are live up on YouTube, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the room. Okay, and we are live.
All right. Well, hey, I wanted to welcome everyone out there. Thanks for joining us today. This is our latest conversation in what has been a really terrific series. It's been a pleasure for us to convene with experts across the country talking about racial equity in real estate in all sorts of different perspectives, looking at in historical perspective, looking at different systems that have operated through this industry through history, but also today, and focusing not only on laments, but solutions. And so it's my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone here. We've got a great group. I don't want to speak too long about myself, but just let me tell you a little bit about why we are convening this. Our office, the Cook County Assessor's Office, is one of the biggest it's the biggest market-based jurisdiction in the United States for property tax assessments. And assessments here are all about equity. It's basically, we use assessments to divide up literally the property tax costs of government amongst us. And here in Illinois, it is an especially equity-focused office because we do not have fixed property tax rates here. We take the amount of money that has to be raised, and then we divide it across all the assessed value in the area, and each property's share of that assessed value becomes the share of the cost of government. So if we get a number wrong, it automatically affects everyone else's share of the pie without any affirmative action having to be taken by the government. So it's very important for how we divide up the cost of government here, and it's very important for the costs that impact individual homeowners in terms of the cost of ownership of their home, but also it can have a feedback effect on the price of their home too. So we'll be talking about all these things later on in solutions, but what I wanted to do was, first of all, introduce all the panelists. Let me start with Keeanga. Keeanga is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. It was published in 2019 and longlisted for a National Book Award for nonfiction and a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in History. She's also an editor of How We Get Free, Black Feminism, and the Combahee River Collective. She's a scholar on racial inequality and public policymaking and the various ways that Black communities have challenged or resisted these constraints. She writes extensively on race and politics, Black social movements and organizing, and radical activism in politics. And she's currently working on a project which is tentatively titled Morning in America, or Black America's Nightmare, Reaganism, Racism in the Long Decade of the 1980s, which will explore the persistence of racial inequality into the 1980s during the successive presidential terms of Ronald Reagan, despite claims of colorblind governance. And that I am eagerly anticipating that myself. I'm the son of a historian, and I think it's really cool that she's also involved in, she's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians by the Organization of American Historians. So, Keeanga, welcome here. And then Scott, shall I go through everyone's bio, or should I just have a bio before each speaker?
Go ahead and just run through the bios real quick, and then we'll go to remarks.
Okay, great. The second person I wanted to introduce is Morgan. I'm sorry, here, let me just make sure I pulled everything up. Morgan Malone. Morgan is she's a former policy analyst at the Chicago Department of Aviation, and she's now the Director of Development and External Affairs at Farpoint. which is developing several major important multi-sector properties in Bronzeville. A very important project going on in part of Chicago that it's actually where I was born. I was born at the Michael Reese Hospital in Bronzeville, and the hospital's not there anymore. And it's a real opportunity to bring new development to Bronzeville, which is a historic neighborhood in Chicago, and to continue to develop Chicago outside of the inner core. The next person after Morgan Malone I wanted to introduce is Frank Williams. So Frank he's received the award from the Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago. He's a resident of the Beverly neighborhood. He left his job with the U.S. Postal Service to become a realtor in 1969. He opened F.J. Williams
66.
Realty. Pardon? I missed that.
1966.
Oh, 1966. I'm sorry. I'm just reading it off the bio
That's
here.
okay. No,
1966. I
it's been
stand
incorrectly
corrected.
often.
And in the wake of the civil rights movement, Williams, he found homes for Black buyers in historically white areas of the southwest side of Chicago, including Ashburn, Auburn, Gresham, Beverly, Brainerd, Morgan Park, Washington Heights. I'm really looking forward to hearing Frank's story because this is a history that's not told enough as we look at Chicago. The south side and west side get a lot of attention, but hearing more about the experiences on the southwest side is a story that needs to be told, and you're an eyewitness to it all, Frank. So I can't wait to hear that. Next, we have David Doig. David is head of Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives. He's been a major driver of development both on the west side of Chicago. He lived in Austin. And he is now driving development down in Pullman, which is one of the most exciting areas of change in Chicago. It has a wonderful industrial legacy and location, and it's experiencing one of the greatest elements of change in Chicago that hasn't had much investment for a very long time. And David will be able to talk about that. He also has a great public policy background in the city, so he brings a lot of perspectives to this. So without any further ado, I want to hand this off to Keeanga, and you can start your opening remarks, Keeanga.
Sure. So thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you all about this important issue. I should say that part of the reason why I agreed to do this is also related to my biography, which is I lived in Chicago longer than I have lived anywhere else in the US. I moved in 2014 when I finished my PhD at Northwestern University. So, you know, and a lot of my research as a graduate student certainly involved issues of race and real estate in Chicago. And before I went to graduate school, I worked as a tenant organizer and developed an intense interest and knowledge of the residential landlord tenant ordinance and went to court with people to forestall or circumscribe their eviction, which is all to say that I'm extremely familiar with the city and issues of race and real estate. So quickly, because we have 5 minutes to make introductory remarks. So I just want to touch on some large issues. The first one being that in discussions like this, I always think it's important to foreground that racism has shaped every aspect of land seizure and development throughout American history, whether it was the initial conquest of the indigenous population, whether it was the mid-19th century distribution of land that had been conquered throughout the West and the exclusion of African Americans from the Homestead Act, or whether it was the creation of the home buying market, the housing market in the earliest days of the 20th century. Racism has been at the foundation of how property has been seized. It has been fundamental to how property has gained value or lost value. And so I'd say that to just emphasize that this is not a new issue. It's not a new phenomenon. And then sometimes I think that we trivialize this history by thinking that what is missing is some quick public policy solution, as if this were something that just occurred and that is something out of whack with our system of housing in this country, and not something that has really been endemic, especially to the business of real estate throughout the 20th century. There is not a single period in the history of real estate or the real estate industry in the United States that is not completely invested in the discriminatory marginalization of African Americans. And so I also think that part of the trick of coming up with a quick public policy solution often involves ignoring public policies that have preceded. And so my book, Race for Profit, is an examination of the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act, which was the first attempt by the United States government to correct its policy of redlining begun in the 1930s and to create low-income homeownership programs directed at African Americans. The intent of those programs was to transform low-income Black renters into low-income Black homeowners. And so I think that part of understanding what has happened or what has gone wrong involves an evaluation of really the problems with previous with previous public policies, and also just understanding the longevity even of our current problem, which is to say that Black people have yet to be, 50% of African Americans have yet to be homeowners in the United States, even in the 50 plus years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And so I think that that also speaks to the longevity of this problem, but it also speaks to the kind of catchphrase from last summer, the systemic racism that is at the root of the marginalization of African Americans in the housing market. That begs the question of why that is and what can be done. I think that part of what I looked at in my book in terms of why these problems continue to persist even after the passage of fair housing in 1968 has to do with the inability of the public sector, whether that nationally is HUD or locally, the kind of local manifestations of housing regulators, the inability for those offices to robustly enforce existing civil rights laws. And the point being that it's not necessarily a new rule or a new law that is needed. Housing discrimination in the buying, selling, renting, financing of homes has been illegal for more than 50 years. The question comes back to why our public institutions, our public regulators, so ill-equipped to enforce the laws as they exist. And I think that that gets into what can actually be done by way of solution, but to say that we should not continue to have these kind of glib conversations about what the solution to the housing crisis is when we understand and absorb its longevity, and which is to say that this is a problem that is deeply embedded in all aspects of American society. And so it's not some quick fix that can happen in the housing market alone to transform these issues of inequity, but require really a reevaluation of how housing is received and distributed in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Keeanga. Okay, next, David. So these are really great points, and we're going to make sure when we have our conversation that we're going to focus during our panel discussion on not only on just solutions that are focused on one area, but we're going to try to see which areas, because it is such a multifaceted problem, Keeanga, how we can think about this at local, state, and federal levels and private sector levels. Okay, so David, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Fritz. So Keeanga kind of approached it, I think, from a systemic and particularly looking at kind of the racial aspect of kind of how race and real estate intersect. I'm going to kind of approach it more from a neighborhood or more of a geographic kind of perspective. And so I've been in this work for over 30 years. I started my career working on the West Side in Lawndale, and then spent some time working at the city. I was the superintendent of the Park District here in Chicago for a number of years, and have really spent the last 15 years working on the far south side in the Pullman and Roseland communities. And so what I've seen are a few kind of, I think, geographically focused issues. And part of this is kind of my own personal experience, but also kind of my work experience, really relate to issues around appraisals and issues of I think what is becoming, the bigger problem in Chicago, which is depopulation. And so starting with appraisals, I'll give you two experiences that I had. So as I mentioned, I started working in Lawndale, and I went to look to buy a house in Lawndale, and I had there was a 3-flat on the 2200 block of South Ridgeway that had been foreclosed. It was a HUD foreclosure, and so I was able to purchase the building, but then I couldn't get a rehab loan because basically the banks had redlined that area, and it didn't matter that I was white or anything really, and it wasn't even related to my income. It was purely based on the fact that I was in an area where the comparable real estate values did not support the rehab loan. So ultimately, I went to neighborhood housing services and was able to get a loan to rehab it. So that was a very early experience I had on the West Side, and then similarly, I got married. We moved to Austin, started having kids, and went to buy the house that we were going to move into, and it was a beautiful old Victorian house on a large kind of corner lot, and the asking price was $250,000, and so I thought, well, that was a good price. So we went to the bank to get the loan, and lo and behold, the appraiser came out and said it was worth $200,000. And so we immediately had this kind of appraisal gap issue. Now, this is literally one block east of Austin Boulevard, one block east of Oak Park. So that same house, a block and a half away, would have appraised for $600,000. So I made the case to the appraiser. I said, listen, you have to look at comparables within a mile radius. They didn't buy my argument. So ultimately, we had to come up with more money for the down payment and basically bridge that appraisal gap to buy the house. So those are two kind of personal examples. And so now with a lot of the work that we're doing in Pullman, we face similar problems where lenders have basically said, we're not gonna look at comparables. We're gonna basically kind of exclude these areas. And so we've had to literally kind of create our own comps. And thankfully we've been successful in moving enough property so we've got good comps. But that's been 10 years of work to get it to the point where actually our appraisals kind of total out with what the value of the homes are. So that's one kind of key issue. I think the other one, as it relates to issues around neighborhood development, is the bigger problem on the south and west sides really relate to, as I said, depopulation. And so you've got areas of the city that are depopulating. And so when you have depopulation and outmigration, you also have in many cases a dysfunctional real estate market. So where we've been working in Pullman, there really wasn't a functioning real estate market. You had a hard time even finding a realtor that would have a listing of a home. And so in addition to the appraisal problems, we also have an issue of realtors and even marketing homes that are for sale. So that's kind of my kind of focus, looking at it from the neighborhood level.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. And a lot of good points there. I think, you used to live in the West Side, and the West Side is where we got the original activism that resulted in the Community Reinvestment Act. We can talk about whether that's been successful or where the gaps are in our infrastructure to measure that. And that relates to those appraisals that you're talking about. The next person I wanted to hand it off to is Frank. Frank, could you make some opening remarks here, and then we'll get to Morgan and then the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. 1865 was the Great Emancipation Proclamation. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. On and on and on. The deck has been stacked against us. The deck is still stacked. I'd just like to run through a little history that I've been involved with personally as we talk about real estate. In 1948, my mother and stepdad purchased a home in Flint, Michigan, a frame home for $6,200, 6% on the land contract interest rate. My stepdad was a veteran, could not use his GI Bill of Rights. We lived, and we talk about it as we talk about segregation and separation. We lived a half a block from the Buick factory, a block and a half from the Flint River, and the trains ran very near our home. So as we talk about values, we were concentrated, and still, in many respects, concentrated in certain areas and certain communities because of things that we've discussed already about denial of opportunities with loans, and certainly the appraisal process. I became a licensed, before, as we talk about the stacked deck, in 1956, I was captain of a state championship football team in Flint, Michigan. But the woman I've been married to for over 60-some years, who happened to have been Caucasian at that time, you don't date, go out with a black fella with a white woman. Well, we've been married for the past 62 years, and we'll be celebrating that next Saturday. Our children will be taking us out for that. They kicked me out of school, and the family sent her away. And we still got together. Now that wasn't easy, an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old to come back from that. So I really call her the comeback kid, because we decided to leave Flint, Michigan and move to Chicago. Well, my first job here in Chicago was at the US Postal Service, and that was considered the creme de la creme for an African-American black male. And I worked there 4 years, but it did not provide me with the inner satisfaction that I thought that I needed to deal with. So as we looked for our first home in 1965, I said, well, my God, these guys are doing well in the real estate business, and those are my Caucasian brothers. I should be able to have a slam dunk in the business. We discussed my then going ahead and selling real estate, because I was taking the courses anyway. And I left the post office in 1966. Of course, those 4 years that I was at the post office, my job responsibility was carrying mail to Robert Taylor Homes from 39th and Federal to 55th, Garfield, State Street, and Federal. I got a chance to learn a whole lot about my people during those years, because first, those 16-story buildings with 10 apartments per floor, and the average family size was 7 and 8 people. I learned a lot about me being a Black person during those 4 years that I carried mail. But once I got into real estate business in 1966 and wasn't doing too bad as a salesperson, and then decided that I needed to open my own office because that was the way to go. And I did. Joanne and I, who was my wife, we opened our office in 9005 South Ashland in January 1971. By the way, this is our 50th year, and we'll be celebrating here in my office building on October 16th. And so those of you that are interested, certainly just reach out to me and be glad to invite you to our reception. So in 1971, the first year we were open, we were demonstrated against us by the North Beverly, the Beverly community, Brainerd. Our office windows were broken, but we continued to move forward and survive and thrive. In 1974, we bought a home in the Beverly community. In 1975, there was a Molotov cocktail put in our, not mailbox, but our doorway, which blew off the front door. So we've had quite an experience as we've dealt with it in community organizations demonstrating and calling names of blockbusters and panic peddlers. Well, if that wasn't enough, in 1979, the Justice Department subpoenaed all of my FHA and VA sales transactions in order to audit and certainly determine if it was time for us to be out of business or go to jail. We survived that, thank God. 1980 through 1985, the IRS audited our firm. So I guess what I'm saying here is that as we talk about continuously roadblocks, for those of us that have worked tremendously to see to it that those of us that look like us are able to live and choose to live where they want to live, there was a continuing education. 1984, it was then the Department of Registration and Education. And as I go through all of these things, I keep copies of all of this in my office here on my desk in order to remind me of from whence we came and the trials and tribulations that we had to overcome. And certainly any of you that would like to get copies of any of this, I'd be very happy to do so. 1990, I became president. Well, in 1974, I became president of the Realtors Group, which is the African American Black group. And I became president of the Realtor organization and certainly brought to the forefront many of the realtor adequacies in providing proper and open housing to us. And certainly today we're hearing more and more about their getting involved some 30, 40 years later. But I thank God that at this time we have done the kind of things necessary to see to it that our realtor organization, because they didn't get on board in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, they didn't encourage the voluntary affirmative marketing agreement until 1975. Well, 1974, which went into 1975. So they've got a lot to answer for, along with all the rest. And Coach Fritz, I know that you at this time is getting a little pressure from some of our state organizations. Thank you for the opportunity. And I just want to say that we need to take a closer look at the MAI, the Member of Appraisal Institute, and we need to take a closer look at AMCs, the appraisal management companies. I thank you.
Frank, that's a great segue because we're going to be talking, we'll be talking about, we're going to use a technical term, the federal mortgage infrastructure, but that goes right to the heart of these appraisals because they're related, and we'll definitely we'll focus in on that. Morgan, take it away, and then we'll go to the panel discussion.
Thank you all so much for having me. I am so excited. My esteemed colleague Dave and I are both working on the Brownsville Lakefront project. And a large part of why I accepted today's panel invite was really to talk about, cultural and intellectual reconciliation and restitution in every industry, to include real estate. A large part of why I signed on for the Brownsville Lakefront project was upfront, the requirement for my participation was inclusive and equitable development. And so when I think about every industry, where we are in this moment, where we've been over the last 60, 70, 100, 200, 20th century, I think about the fact that every industry that we are a part of was created without marginalized people, marginalized voices, and marginalized experiences as integral to the way that we understand the knowledge that we think we know today. And that includes the real estate industry. And a large part of my advocacy really is, how do we resist in every industry and think critically about the foundation on which an industry rests, and then undo that intellectual property, which includes policies that are already existing, to think critically about where we're going to go in the future, because acknowledgement isn't enough. There are a lot of organizations and a lot of companies, a lot of departments who are acknowledging race, who are acknowledging systemic inequity and racial inequity. And thank you. And also, in order to actually undo systemic harm, it's not going to just be new policies or even undoing old policies, because the real system that is tying all of this together as glue is intangible. It's in our behaviors, attitudes, cultures, mindsets, because we are the creators of these systems. We are the governors of these systems. And so it's not that government is happening to us. It's not that all of these things are happening to us. We are the entities that make up these institutions that are deciding. We are the middle managers that are deciding. We are the executives that are deciding. And so until we are able to also simultaneously shift culture and shift hearts and minds and people and shift standards culturally across industries, across America, we are going to keep coming up with solutions, whether they are well-intended, policy or program-wise, that still are underlined by those inequities and those cultural challenges. And even the things that we think we want to see as we change policy, somebody still has to implement. And the people who are implementing are still people who agree with the way that things have been. And so how do we do that layered work across real estate to be actually responsive and undo systemic harm and reimagine what real estate looks like? I had a call earlier this week with your office, and I asked, well, what happens if we just didn't assess real estate? Is there anything else to assess? And so there are questions and there are things to try to figure out. There are ways to reimagine and be bold and to try new things, whether that's new revenue sources, whether that's new programs, whether that's new policies. What is it that we can do to make sure that we are being responsive to resident retention? Because ultimately, that's what people are asking me. We're doing this wonderful development. We're so excited about it. The goal is for it to be both equitable and inclusive. And also, we've got 60,000 people who live in Brownsville who want to know about resident retention and displacement and what we're going to do. And so how do we partner with city agencies, with state agencies, with federal government to come up with policies and programs that are responsive to not just real estate and housing, but cost of living as a whole, and pull all of these pieces together to truly be holistically responsive while also engaging in intellectual and cultural reconciliation. It's not just the cash. It is also our mindsets that enable systems for the long haul. And so that's the perspective I'll be bringing tonight. I know I only have a couple of minutes, so thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Morgan, that is a great point that you made. I think one of the deepest aspects of unfairness is how government is financed itself. And basically local government in the United States, and especially in Illinois, leans so heavily on raising revenue from taxing brick and mortar, which is how Black people have more of their savings that they do have, the same with Latino people, in housing equity, yet they face some of the highest rates because of the way the structure is set up. While there's more and more of the economy, which is digital, which does not pay for any of these government services at all. And that in itself is a systemic barrier to not only to fairness, but also to wealth building in itself. So I just want to lead off the questions for the panel discussion today. and Keeanga and Frank, I think you're great to lead off on this, is if you're looking at the way folks, when they want to finance home purchases today and make a home purchase today, what are the barriers that people face today in doing this and getting access to the wealth building features that our federal mortgage infrastructure has already created and many people have benefited from over generations?
You want to go, Doctor?
Sure. I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think that there are many contributing factors. I think, you know, there are factors that have to do with buyers. You know, I think that is not the only issue, but I do think that disparate incomes, the lack of wealth accumulation over time, the lack of access to family wealth. You know, I think in this market in particular, where you have the lack of inventory has driven up prices in the housing market so much that, you know, this is a market that African Americans, ordinary Black people will find very difficult entering. Not only do you have the phenomenon of investment firms like Blackstone, for example, buying up billions of dollars of what are referred to as starter homes, right? Single family homes on the low end of the market. Blackstone is buying them with the intention of turning them into rentals. And so that entry point is becoming smaller. And then you have the kind of exponential rise in prices. So for example, I live in a neighborhood in Philadelphia. It's a historically integrated neighborhood. It's Mount Airy. There's a West Mount Airy and East Mount Airy. I live in East Mount Airy, which has been traditionally has a larger Black population. So East Mount Airy is about 68% Black. About 6 weeks ago, a friend of mine made an offer on a house, a Black woman made an offer on a house about 4 blocks from me. This was a 2,400 square foot twin, which is would probably be described as a townhouse in Chicago. It's not part of a row, but it's 2 homes that are connected. They share a wall. 2,400 square feet, a small front yard, a small backyard in East Mount Airy. This is a house that when I moved here in 2014, I bought a similar sized property. It was a little bit smaller in West Mount Airy for $270,000. So this house 6 weeks ago was listed for $500,000. When the friend of mine made an offer on the house, she found out that 29 other people had made an offer on the house, and it sold for $108,000 over listing. And so in that scenario, it was a young white couple whose parents swooped in with cash and, you know, agreed to forego the assessment, agreed to forego the inspection or the appraisal, the inspection, the entire thing. And so in this market in particular, I think that we'll see the numbers of Black homeowners that have fluctuated between 40 and 47% over the last 2 or 3 years really begin to peel away. So those are some of the kind of issues on the buyer side. I think on the institutional side, there have been multiple studies, investigations over the last 2 years, even dating back to the 2008 crisis, that point to the continuation of institutional roadblocks for African Americans, whether it was the scandals involving the subprime lending, but more recently, we have read about here in Philadelphia, the misuse of the Community Reinvestment Act, where young white couples are being given home loans, and that is qualifying as investing in historically neighborhoods that have experienced redlining historically, but now are undergoing gentrification, and young white couples are moving in and utilizing, being able to receive the benefits of the Community Reinvestment Act. We know that lending qualifications or restrictions have become stringent again. And so this is just to say that there are both institutional issues, and then there are long-standing issues that have to do with job discrimination, the lack of generational wealth that has meant Black people experience disproportionate poverty or disproportionately lacking in the kinds of long-term resources that are necessary. There was the expose from the Newsweek organization in Long Island that showed racial discrimination by realtors is still quite robust in terms of steering and directing people from one neighborhood to another based on race. And so I think that both sets of issues are quite critical to determining the access that Black people, or the lack of access that Black people have into the homeownership market.
There's so much good stuff in there, Keeanga. We'll come to that. Frank, you want to build off of that? Because
yeah, just I have several things that I think are very important. Is, there's three positives before we get to our biases: family, nepotism, partiality. Those those you're close to, you're going to see to it that they get their share and they're part of the pie. Then after that, our biases trigger in, and that's when we call about the racism and all the other things and opportunities that we've been denied. We're not a poor people. We may be uneducated about the real estate process, but we need to take a stronger position in moving these institutions. We as a people need to have some guts and confront the issue when we get in a position, sitting at a table, to certainly make it known from whence we came and how we arrived at this position. So it's going to take a lot on both of our parts. We've got to teach as well as have some guts.
And Frank,
and also, before we finish it, just let me do this here. The appraisal numbers, the numbers of appraisers in the US, the percentage of appraisers, it's almost 78% are white Caucasians. 4.5% are Black African Americans, and 3.5% Latino. And the rest is broken up into the other racial ethnic groups, with about 7% that have chosen not to be identified with any of the groups.
Well, the appraisals concern, I can just tell anecdotally that when we were reassessing the South suburbs last year, one of our top political leaders in Illinois said, we reassessed his home, and he said, Fritz, your assessment is up from where it was before, but it's about where Zillow is, and it's about where I think I could sell my home. Well, that's good, but I just tried to refinance my house, and my lender said it was worth $100,000 less than what you did. You're both looking at the data, the same data. How is this possible? And I find this very troubling, what you're saying, Frank. I'm seeing lots of patterns of this. And I sort of go back to the Community Reinvestment Act that Keeanga was talking about, because I think the US mortgage market is it's kind of evolving away from these regulations that were put in place to protect people. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago, which talked about how almost more than 2/3 of mortgage originations in the United States are not made by banks anymore. They're made by non-banks, which are called shadow banks, which are things like Quicken Loans. They are not deposit-taking institutions, they're conduits, and they're not covered by the same rules that banks are. And I'm concerned that these appraisals are taking advantage of a gap in our federal mortgage infrastructure, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are still guaranteeing these mortgages, but they're not requiring the same reinvestment obligations and other obligations that banks have. David, or Morgan, are you seeing this in the areas where you're active?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you've touched on a really key point. Many of those mortgage banks are completely unregulated. And so they operate without the same, really without the same set of rules that banks have to follow. So there is no CRA for mortgage banking. And consequently, they can discriminate. They can choose to look at one appraisal over the other. And they have a lot more flexibility and discretion. And so, yeah, I don't know how you're able to really kind of push lenders to do the right thing and make loans more equitably if you don't have some kind of regulatory control. And I think, to Frank's point, look at the appraisal industry. I mean, the disparity between just the people that are appraisers, it's unbelievable. And so even that industry, how is it regulated? What kind of regulations and guidelines are given, and how are those enforced? And I would say, I have most respect for Frank. Frank and I have been friends for 30 years, and he is one of the kind of hidden gems of Chicago's South Side. I mean, you heard his personal story, but I mean, he has literally poured his life into neighborhoods and into making sure that people had a fair chance. But Frank is unique as a realtor. There are a lot of realtors, also an unregulated industry, don't have that same spirit. And so, realtors just redline neighborhoods. I mean, there are areas of the South and West Side where you can't find realtors, and
check is in the mail.
Yeah, no, but this is ridiculous. I mean, there's no kind of incentive for realtors to operate in some neighborhoods, and so you have these huge disparities. You've got legions of realtors in places like Lincoln Park and Lakeview and Rogers Park, and then you got a community like Roseland where we've got like maybe two realtors in the whole neighborhood. So how is that anywhere fair?
Well, and David, the point that you made, Frank, and the point that you made, David, I wanted to ask Morgan. So let's say that a household has arranged for financing to be able to.
Let me, before you get to that, Fritz, can I just say one thing about mortgage banking? In the 60s and the 70s, that's where we were able to get loans for our folks. But just showed you how the script flips and change. And Harold Washington said, to me in the 70s, that when you pass a piece of legislation, and you guys know it, that not just passing it through the House and the Senate, but it is the appropriations for that piece of legislation and the committee that writes the rules for the implementation of that legislation. And of course, those of us have got to be enough of us to have a closer watch and negotiate better those things.
I don't want to zoom past this before we move to the next question. I think it's really important for us to also call out the fact that who are the appraisers and the realtors? With what eyes are they looking at the homes? So, with what pipeline is that created? You don't have to have a college degree to be a realtor. Who is promoting that? What are the cost barriers? What are the actual barriers in the testing for people who look like me to be the appraiser and the realtor? And then with what eyes are you reviewing a home to appraise it?
Say it again.
Say it's valuable, the aesthetic is excellent. Like those types of things are so subjective because the way that we review design elements are really cultivated based on our personal point of reference of what we believe excellence to be, which often is suburban or well-to-do areas in urban communities. And so the person who has the opportunity to make the subjective call, again, does not have the intellectual or cultural engagement, competency, lens, view to even look at elements of other people's homes and value them appropriately, not in addition to just bias, Black family lives here, reducing the homeowner's value because Black family lives here. In addition to that, there's also just the additional reduction on how you view this, period, aesthetically.
Morgan, it's such a good point. And from
Amen.
from our perspective here, at the assessor's office, we're looking at all the transactions that have taken place, and we create a valuation model using those transactions, and we really scratch our head at what we see these appraisals coming in at when they're looking at the same data. And we think that there might be some combination of banks and lenders looking at the other way when they see these patterns of disfavor for, they're basically, the appraisal gives a lender a fig leaf for not investing in a neighborhood or providing less financing, and they're looking the other way even when they know these appraisers might be engaging in behavior that's not on the level. I think one of the things that will really help is sunlight from the bottom and from the top. So there is a commission that's now been created. It's now being chaired by Susan Rice. I know there's legislation in Congress. One of the co-sponsors is Bobby Rush, who's the congressman for the 1st District here, who himself has been affected by this behavior with appraisals. And I think we should, at the top level, we should open up this database of appraisals that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac oversee so that we can see which comps and which appraisers tend to have a pattern like this. And then we, from the bottom up, we open our platform so that people can see our valuation model, and we will love be able to compare side by side how our model is coming up with values and what we looked at, and how appraisers are doing that too. And I think sort of scrutiny using data science can help us a little bit with that, but these systems go so deep. I think this question I wanted to get to is, even if you get financing for a home, we also have this deeper problem, Keeanga, of even if once you own a home, some places have better potential for growth in their value than others, that itself can have a racial pattern. I can tell you a little bit about how taxes affect that, but I'm curious if you've seen, Keeanga, even once you get the ability to have home equity, are there other structures that can prevent growth in the wealth of some communities, and others you'll get more favors from the government on this?
Sure. There's a couple of things about that. One, I will say that my book, Race for Profit, it's always distressing to hear this as in the kind of modern housing market, because my book is about the late 1960s, the early 1970s, and the federal government's first effort to try to help Black people become homeowners. And it's the same thing. It's an unregulated market that is dominated by mortgage bankers who, are basically left to operate as they will. It is FHA appraisers who are part-time real estate agents who help inflate the value, in this case, of homes, because this is part of a kind of fraudulent activity. When the FHA was guaranteeing home loans for poor and working class Black families, they would inflate the value of the homes. The mortgage bankers make the loans. The families realize that the houses are falling apart. They walk away. and the mortgage bank gets the loan back. In total, the appraiser has been bribed and the real estate agent has made their commission, and everyone has cashed in on this program except Black families whose credit is destroyed, and who are forced to leave these homes that then become abandoned, that then become the reason 25, 30 years later that bankers then say that these communities are subprime. These communities are risky for investment, and that becomes the pretext for treating Black consumers differently yet again. And so, which is to say that these are patterns that continue to present themselves because we have a state that refuses to take this seriously, the federal government. And so in the 1970s, you have FHA agents who are being indicted. You have mortgage bankers who are being indicted, but the congressional investigations focus on Black women, on Black mothers, and say that somehow their homekeeping skills are the reasons why these houses were in disrepair. And they become the focal point of these programs, while you have white men surrounding them who are being indicted for crimes. And so this is part of the reason why this history continues to repeat itself, is because there is a complete and total lack of political will to enforce the laws that we actually have on the books. And part of that is structural. Part of it is because of the way that the federal government has almost completely outsourced the production of any and all housing to the private sector. And because the federal government is completely dependent on the market model and the private sector to produce housing, it imperils its ability to police the private sector. There is no will to police the private sector. And so that is to me at least, that is the core of the problem that we have to address. And then, of course, within that market, part of what I look at is the way that home ownership functions differently for Black families in the whole than it does for white families. For Black families, all too often, home ownership has not been this asset that accrues in value over time, that you can then pass the spoils of onto your family members so that it can continue to perpetuate itself as it has for white families historically, at least since the 1930s. Instead, for Black people, it becomes a debt burden. And it is conceived of differently. If you purchase a home in Inglewood, right, or Chatham, the idea that is going to accrue in value over time that you can then pass on to the next generation is delusional. It's just delusional. And so it means, what does this mean then for the value of home ownership for poor and working class Black families? That becomes this social goal, right? We talk about Black poverty, Black inequality, the wealth gap. Everyone needs to become a homeowner, right? That is the universal solution, without looking at the ways in which home ownership functions differently. That doesn't mean that we should sit back and tolerate discrimination in appraising or in the real estate market writ large. That people should just be passive about that. But I do think that this model, this kind of knee-jerk reaction around home ownership, without ever thinking about the ways that Black property is devalued. The Brookings Institute did a study that showed in Black majority communities, homes in Black majority communities are devalued to the tune of $150 billion compared to homes in white majority communities of the same make and model, except for the population of people living there. And so this is about a much larger issue, I think, even than just the function of the real estate market.
Keeanga,
You know,
that's such a good point. Morgan?
Yeah, I was going to say, to Keeanga's point, that real estate doesn't exist in a vacuum. The people, we have to talk about how people experience or do not experience access to quality of life. Even if you do end up in a community where you were able to purchase a home 70 years ago that was passed down to your family, and now, surprise, you're next to Obama Presidential Center and it's worth $800,000. That doesn't mean that the other systemic barriers are keeping up with your home value. That doesn't mean that your income is now able to sustain the cost in property taxes now that your home has that extra equity. That doesn't mean that you haven't already pulled that equity out for what is commonly known as the Black tax and some other challenge or systemic barrier response to send your kids to college, to eliminate debt, to do caregiving, to do childcare, whatever it is you would be using the equity in that home for to begin with. So the idea that just because your home value goes up, you're automatically building generational wealth, that's absolutely not true in a lot of places in the Black community because of the other factors. And I won't go down our rabbit hole about why data is racist, but to think that we are going to just solve our way out of this with data, and data objectively is going to inform what we're doing, without actually thinking about the experience of real estate inequity and how that evolves as an ecosystem, and simultaneously pulling from the same side of the rope and addressing those inequities in every turn with a number of different partners who are supposed to inform a variety of different policies around cost of living, wage, income, access to quality of life for all people, resources, amenities, housing, shelter, food, et cetera, is ludicrous. Real estate is just one spoke in a wheel of a wicked problem. And so all of those things are just not guarantees in a Black community. If you are in Brownsville right now, so many of those homes, you can't buy a home in Brownsville for under $700,000 in a lot of places. But what does that actually mean when you have a higher burden of inequity and also a higher burden of cost of living and generational debt to carry? Nothing.
It's also in that situation. And I mean, you have homes in the 60653 zip code that, if they were 5 miles north, would be over $1 million. And so even for Black middle class people, their proximity to other Black people puts a cap on what the value of those properties will be. And so the whiter the neighborhood is, the further away from Black people you are, the more in value that property accrues. And this is what is meant in real estate, at least, about systemic discrimination and systemic inequity.
Yeah, Fritz, can I just add one more thing? You asked about kind of what are the things that makes ongoing home ownership, and one of the issues that we've seen over and over again is the cost of property insurance. If you look at the rates relative to the values in Black neighborhoods, the rates that insurance agents charge for property insurance is dramatically more, and they'll make every reason, well, the area has more crime, the area has more vandalism, there are more fires, there are more, but fundamentally it boils down to that's a cost that's passed on every year to that homeowner, which makes it more unaffordable, and in many cases forces people to have to cut back on other things like improving their homes to pay for insurance.
Amen. And I wanted to show a chart here that speaks to one of the deepest inequities that speaks to what Morgan was talking about, what Keeanga was talking about. This is a chart of property tax rates that we have just in Cook County. And I want you all to look at how the places with the highest rates are also the places with the most Black people. And so, and what you see here is that the rates are 3 to 5 times in the top 20 highest rate communities, which are almost all majority Black. 3 to 5 times what they are in the rest of the county. This is the same county. What that means is that once you buy a home, once you've invested $1 in a home, the ability to compound your wealth is being eaten away by the tax rate in these communities. It's like I used to manage a mutual fund. It's like a very high fee mutual fund that can eat away something that's supposed to compound 3 or 5% a year. But if you have to pay an extra 3 or 5% in a tax rate, that is going to eat away that ability to compound growth. And what we've done here in the assessor's office is try to eliminate assessment bias as a source of this. But to my friends in the south suburbs who experience this, and this is why I got into this, assessment bias in a lot of these south suburbs is not the problem. The problem is that they do not have much property value in these places, and yet these communities have to carry most of the cost of educating their children, and most property taxes are for schools. And so this goes to this really deep systemic bias in our country that people in a community are supposed to cover all the costs of educating their kids themselves. And if you don't have property wealth in that community, you're automatically sort of signing up for a system where people in poorer communities have to pay higher rates on their wealth that eat away at their ability to compound. And this is really an outgrowth of, in our state, we are dead last in the United States for state sharing of the cost of educating children with local school districts. So we're the most extreme example in the United States, right here in Illinois, for pushing all the costs of educating children onto the backs of people to tax their own wealth. And Black people have more of their wealth invested in homes than other racial groups do. So this setup is automatically destroying wealth from the way I see it. And the way we solve this, I really like to focus on solutions. I'm just going to talk real quickly about it, and then we're going to get to the great questions we have from the audience. To me, it's changing how you finance schools. And it's more urgent than ever because brick and mortar is less and less important in our economy. More and more things are going digital. We're doing this over Zoom. We're seeing people don't shop at department stores and malls like they used to. They're shopping at Amazon. They're doing remote offices. People are more and more footloose. This is going to become more extreme. The way we need to fix this is go back to what A. Philip Randolph originally had as one of the core of the civil rights movement. So there needs to be more federal funding for schools, especially for folks where they're disadvantaged students. And this is not only a basic matter of financing a good, which is education, but it can also reduce that rate disparity on taxes. And it would actually be, if the federal government doubled what it spends on Title I, which is only $15 billion, in principle, that could cover 10% reduce the levy by more than 10% in a lot of these South suburban communities. That would be like a jolt of adrenaline, all the people who've invested their wealth in their homes. And it's a leverage investment that they made through debt. So it could really, this is one of the ways we could remedy things in a powerful way. I think $15 billion is what our government eats for breakfast every morning. That's less than what was given to the airlines to bail them out. I think that's one of the best solutions to trying to narrow that rate gap there, because a lot of people in the South suburbs, a lot of people are watching us here today. In the South suburbs of Chicago, a homeowner pays more in tax than they do on their mortgage. I know so many people are in that position. Frank, you want to close this out, and then we're going to go to Q&A. How about or Frank, if you don't have anything to add, let's just go to Q&A. Scott, do you want to read any questions?
Sure. So the first question we got was from Jarrell, and he had a question about the differences between appraisals that are appraising the value of a property and the assessed value for purposes of taxing. What are some of the differences there? You mentioned the state official who said there were some differentiations between what he was seeing from the bank, what he was seeing in his assessed value. Where do those differences come from? How does that happen?
Well, they're supposed to be the same. They're supposed to be an assessment is a government body using a valuation model to estimate the market value of a house. And the other is a private entity estimating the value of a house for the purposes of collateral for a mortgage. Now, they're both looking at the same information, but the incentives may be different. So now, it's not the case in Illinois. Actually, assessments do not raise revenue here. They just affect the share of a fixed amount of dollars that are going to be raised. So here, if you change assessment policy, it doesn't change how much a government body raises. But in some parts of the country, there are fixed property tax rates, and the more that your local assessor assesses the home at, the more revenue a local government body can make. So that may be an incentive for, in some parts of the country, for the government to aim high in what it estimates the value of a home to be. And modest homes across the United States have shown to be there to be a bias towards overassessment of modest homes, because for many different reasons. Some of it intentional, some of it just may be a pattern in the data that has a bias pattern where you don't have enough information about conditions and quality. Now, on the appraisal side, this is a private entity estimating the value of a home, and some private entities may have an incentive to underestimate if they don't want to lend there. This may be happening in a lot of the stories that we're seeing that Scott, that I mentioned earlier, but that others see all over the place that you were talking about, Frank. And so I always want to know, if you're looking at the same data, why is there a difference? And so this is why we really want to highlight, if the federal government can open up its appraisal data from the top, because they have the best trove of appraisal data. All these appraisals are going into a federal government database. Open that up and then let assessors across the United States show how they're assessing things. We can highlight these differences and hopefully narrow that. Next question.
So we had a question from Michael Chavaria, and he mentions recent local research into public housing authorities' homeownership voucher programs, and finding that those programs are woefully underutilized, which misses opportunities to shift countless Black households that receive long-term rental assistance to homeowners receiving shorter-term mortgage assistance at a cost savings to these programs. And he notes that property tax policy could help these programs be successful and drive investment into Black households and communities, and asks if that's something the assessor's office would explore, work with advocates and program participants to support these programs. And I think, then a good follow-up question for our panel is, what other kinds of policy solutions are there like this that, public offices like ours could be involved in?
Sorry, I'm reading the full question.
Yeah. If anyone wants to take a swing at that, we've got some others.
I think just on the question of public housing, using public housing vouchers for home ownership, we have very limited experience with this, but the experience we do have is that it's still very difficult for lenders to underwrite those, because it's unclear, like, how long is that voucher going to last? What if income goes up? Do they lose the voucher? It just, there isn't a lot of marketplace kind of testing of using vouchers as a tool to promote homeownership within public housing agencies.
And I just wanted to build on Michael's question. I want to look at this. There are our council here. There's a constitutional limit in Illinois on how assessments work for housing. So the lowest classification rate, which is 10% for residential, can be the maximum difference between it and the highest rate, which is for commercial, can be 2.5 times. So if we have to be careful, if there's a class of residential housing that will be assessed at less than 10% of market value, how are we going to do this? Now, there are ways that we are assessing affordable housing, and we're making sure that affordable housing is really a separate asset class from other residential, because there are restrictions on on the rent that affordable housing units can charge. There are restrictions on what they can sell housing for. So that that sort of creates a whole different class that allows us to be within the constitutional limit. But I want to learn more about this, Michael. Scott's going to take it down. I think it's an interesting idea. How about we go to the next question?
Sure. So here's a question about the progress that our office has made on sort of historical overassessment of lower value residential and commercial properties and underassessment of higher value residential and commercial properties. There was also a big New York Times article about this in which Chris Berry had looked at how this issue affects not just Cook County in the past, but other areas as well. And I know that we've looked at a lot of solutions for this. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about what those reform efforts look like.
Sure. So let me talk about commercial, then I'll talk about residential. I don't want to take up too much time because we got some great guests here. On the commercial side, we had a study done by the International Association of Assessing Officers, which are the gold standard in our world, to look at transactions that have commercial transactions that happened in 2018 in Cook County, to see how far, and those are assessments that were done before our administration. And it showed that commercial properties on average in Cook County were 40% underassessed versus what they transacted at. And in the city of Chicago, it was actually closer to 50%. That difference alone meant that billions of dollars were transferred onto the backs of residential homeowners, to the tune of, about $1,000 per year in Chicago each year, year in, year out. And then there was also a burden transferred onto the small businesses in the neighborhood from the bigger properties downtown. So incredibly regressive, incredibly unfair. Our assessment system is supposed to be a mirror to the market. So we are dedicated to closing that valuation gap. The last 2 years, our assessments in the suburbs have closed that gap. Chicago, we're reassessing this year, and people can follow it and see that we are closing that gap. We're subscribing to all the best commercial sources of data to show valuation. And we've tried to push for legislation in Illinois that would give us better data reporting so we could get a better view. Everyone could get a better view into where this data is that drives value for big commercial properties. We think that regressive pattern in commercial properties that we saw in 2018 was part of a pattern. The data that is missing, that we're not measuring, tends to reward the biggest properties and tends to penalize the smallest properties. And that we see that on the residential side too. On the residential side, sure. Frank, I can just go real quickly and then I'll let you break in. Is that all right? I promise I won't take too long. On the residential side, we think a lot of the bias that was there before, there have been the estimates that the bottom third properties were 80% over assessed versus the top end properties. And Chris Berry's research showed that was true not only in Cook County, but in many parts of the country. We're using models that do not build in that same kind of bias. There are models that are much more sensitive to locational factors and other factors that are allowing us to really compress that difference. But there is some missing data that still tends to lead to overassessment of more modest properties, and that has to do with condition and interior, and what's been done in the interior. Generally, lower end homes do not have the Martha Stewart kitchen or the rehab that tends to enhance the value of it. And the federal government has really good data on this, and we're part of a group of assessors that is going to be asking the federal government to make some of that data available to us so we can further reduce close that data gap that's created that disparity. So the statistics that when we've reassessed the suburbs, we've mostly eliminated that gap. There's still a little bit to go based on interior condition. We're trying to get that from all the sources that are out there. So I wanted to hand that off. Frank, did you want to break in?
Now, I just wanted to add, we need to certainly take a much closer look at commercial developments, downtown developments, and include in the closer look is the MAIs and whether or not those values are coming in where those developments are succeeding rather than failing, and we are bailing those out through our tax dollars and other things.
Amen, Frank. There's a whole industry out there whose whole lifeblood is based on arguing that a bacon double cheeseburger is a salad. And when we come across those appraisals, we are reporting them to the regulator here in the state. They've never received complaints from our office before, but we are starting. This is sort of gets back to there needs to be a multi-level approach to eliminating these biases, and that is part of it. There are quite substantial biases in how properties like that have been appraised, Frank. Very good point. So do we have another question?
Well, we just had one question about rehab funding. If there's a building in demo court, not because the building is structurally compromised, but because there was some kind of what the questioner called illicit activity going on there in the past. This person sounds like a developer who's, she says, hoping to bring new life into it and bridge the affordable housing shortage that banks are numb to. It is a 440-acre proposed lakefront development near South Lakeshore Drive. So I guess for folks who are trying to bring more housing online in areas that larger lenders are ignoring, what are there sources out there that can help those kinds of developers? And David, it seems like this might be and Morgan might be a good question for the two of you to weigh in on.
Yeah, so on the, I would say on the 1 to 4 unit rehab side, neighborhood housing service is a great source for financing. On the larger, the five and up, it's Community Investment Corp, CIC, is a great tool for purchase and rehab financing.
I was going to echo those sentiments.
Okay, and those are the questions that we've got. So I think we can probably just go to closing remarks. I think if we give each panelist just a couple minutes to offer some closing thoughts, and then Fritz will bring us home.
Okay, Keeanga, how about you lead us off?
Sure. This is, been a good conversation, and again, I appreciate the invitation to participate. I think, someone wrote in the chat that what do we do, right? What is, I often participate in meetings that lay out the kind of historical and contemporary crisis in housing, the roots to it, why it's happening. And, that often gets then kind of cobbled into niche solutions for this or that particular thing. And then we still have this enormous reality of inequity and continuing discrimination that really continues to shape the housing market. And so, I don't think that there is a quick solution or silver bullet to this, but I do think that getting an understanding of what the problem is and why the problem exists is critical to shaping what it is that is actually done in raising different kinds of questions, including how is it that more than 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act that outlawed discrimination, racial discrimination in the buying, selling, financing, renting of homes and property in this country, that these problems continue to persist. And why is it so difficult to get our federal government to actively actually enforce the law and regulate in ways that it is commanded to do so? And I think until we really start to get at those systemic questions and demand the changes on that level, then we continue to have these discussions that sort of connect with the outrage, but don't ultimately transform the situation. Or worse, we fall into blaming those who are most victimized by this, because that is much easier to do. It is easier to blame people who are victimized by, the inequities of the housing market than to actually deal with the influence of real estate on public policy making or the sclerotic pace of change in implementing all of these issues that we know that can be done but aren't. And so that's the challenge in this particular moment, I think.
Thanks, Keeanga. David?
Yeah, I would just say, kind of building out what Keeanga said, I do think there are examples of other places that have moved the property tax burden away from the local assessments and local taxes. I think of like Minnesota, where they I don't know, probably a decade ago, they switched the funding formula for schools from primarily property tax and pushed it more to sales tax, and then allowed students to go to any school in the state. And so I think there are examples. I don't know that we've got the political will in Illinois to do something like that, but I think we can learn. It's not that it's never been done. It's just there's the will there to do it. So I think there are lots of other places that we can learn from as well.
Thanks, David. Frank?
I'm going to wake up tomorrow once again, attempting to do in my best to see that these changes within our system are implemented. It will not be done unless I, along with others, get up with the intent of moving this forward with some guts, with some tenacity, with some fortitude to deal with it.
Thank you, Frank. And we are all, I think events like this, we can start to harness and bring together people with different backgrounds to focus on these key questions. Because
absolutely.
And Morgan, how about you make the last comment, and then I'll come up. I'm going to quickly list some of my solutions, and we'll see how consequential.
Absolutely. I think as we think through solutions, it's critical to know that equity is not inherent to any outcome. Equity lives in people, policy, process, and holistic experience. It matters not only what you say you're going to do on paper, not only what you tell people to do and what process you put in place, it also matters how people feel and how they experience whatever you create. How does government meet people where they're at? How do people experience the institution of government? And so I think it's really, really critical. It's not enough to say, how do we make we're going to do a homeowner, we're going to put more money in people's pockets, we're going to do this. All of those things ignore the system of inequity and are not wholly responsive. And it takes wholly responsive to see change. When we think critically about, okay, somebody bought a home and now it's worth, 5 times more than what they got. Again, that's not inherently wealth, depending on your generational debt. Same thing with more policies, to do more programs, to put more money in people's pockets so that they can be homeowners. That does not eliminate other cost stressors that prohibit you from being a homeowner and utilizing that extra money in your pocket. So those types of things, as well-intentioned as we all are, we have to be steadfast in the fact that equity is not inherent. It is fought for. It lives in all of us. In our decision-making, we are all a player in this system of decision-making. And how important is equity to our mindset in our own decision-making where we have influence and power, in addition to how we use our voices to advocate, influence other people's positions of power in order to respond to the experiences we all want to see as a society. So if you leave with nothing else, I hope that everyone is willing to show up tomorrow to do the work of equity.
Thank you, Morgan. And I'm loving the action in the chat too. So while I'm talking, you guys can read that too. I think we got some good stuff going on in the chat. I just wanted to think, my solutions I've sort of organized into the financing side of the equation, and then the taxation side of the equation, which I think is also linked to the ability to grow housing values too. So on the financing side, I agree with Keeanga that so much of this relates to where is the coverage of our federal mortgage financing infrastructure, and is it really covering everyone? And is it being properly regulated? And there's, one of the senators who sits on the Senate Finance Committee, she says that personnel is policy, that the kinds of people that you have and the priorities that they have in overseeing this regulatory infrastructure are really important. But just as important are the people who watch them in Congress. And so all of us can really light a fire under this and say that, hey, a lot of these laissez-faire assumptions do not get the job done. It results in more inequity. And we need to make sure that our federal mortgage financing infrastructure, which is there for all of us, it's a public good, must cover everyone. There cannot be any gaps. We cannot leave people out. We cannot have this pattern of favoritism. There's this fancy term they use in Washington, regulatory arbitrage, which is really just evading the rules. That's one of the things that needs to be addressed at the federal level. But the other issue is taxation. And first of all, we need to make sure that assessments are not making worse the disparities that already exist in our housing market and in our taxation system. So assessors across the United States have to re-examine models that they've been using that have built-in biases, that are using data that themselves have an inherent bias. They need to use better models that do not do that and subject themselves to tests, so to make sure they do not have those biases that the folks like Chris Berry has found. So that's what we can do on assessments, while also making sure that commercial properties are fully assessed according to the market. You're being a proper mirror to the market like you should, and you're not letting it get warped and distorted through things like appeals or other kinds of rules that can really exhibit favoritism to the disfavor of people who are not inside the power structure of the tax appeals process and to power. But the other thing that is really important besides assessments is taxation, how we raise money for schools, because that decision itself has a huge systemic impact. A lot of people in the chat have been talking about the South suburbs. And I got involved in this because I went to high school on the South Side. It's majority Black, and most of my classmates had moved to the South suburbs in the 90s and 2000s. And I heard stories from them about how they thought they were doing the right thing. They bought a home in a community like Harvey or Country Club Hills, and their house value went down 50% in the housing crisis, and they were left underwater, but their taxes went up, and they want to know why. And some of it was due to assessments, but most of it was due to the fact that communities like Harvey, which felt disinvestment and were hit hardest by the housing crisis, where housing values fell 50%, they had to pay the very same amount of dollars to cover the cost of education. No help from the state, no help from the federal government. How do we reverse this? We need to re-examine Title I, which is the federal program to support schools, especially schools in poorer communities. That can make the government moving its small toe on this can make a really big difference for tax rates in communities like Harvey, an enormous difference. And our state, number 50 in the United States, needs to be covering more of the cost of educating schools. So communities like Harvey don't have to tax themselves 3 to 5 times the level of the rest of the county and destroy and hold back the wealth of that person in Harvey who did not create this housing crisis to begin with. So those are my ideas: federal financing for schools, state support for schools, eliminate biases from assessments, and better federal regulation of our mortgage infrastructure. Everybody, I think this is going to be, we've had some great conversations. This was terrific. Thank you everyone, for our panelists for being here, and for the audience for being here. You've had a really great conversation. We've learned a lot from you. And we hope we'll have more. We hope we can bring you back for more. If you have ideas for other people we should be talking to, I know we built a really great, we got some frequent flyers here. People who have other ideas for speakers we should bring. Tell us who you want to bring to panels like this. We can bring some of the folks back here if they're nice enough to come, but we can bring others to come. So tell us who you want to convene. We'll get them for you. And we want to be back to continue the conversations on this very important topic. Thank you, everyone, and wanted to salute you for being here. Thank you, Keeanga. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.